Welcome back. Now, according to a new Deloitte global study, South African working women feel their physical health, mental well-being, work-life balance and ability to switch off from work has deteriorated over the past year. They are also as stressed and slightly more burnt out than their global counterparts. And while they are getting to grips with the hybrid work environment, many still struggle with flexibility and predictable working patterns. Now in its third year, the study surveyed 5,000 women across 10 countries, including 500 in South Africa, and found some signs of progress for women in the workplace. During the survey period between October 2022 and January this year, rates of burnout dropped, non-inclusive behaviours declined, and hybrid work experiences improved. 80% of South African respondents are in full-time employment, while 13% are part-time, including gigs employment. Now, to help us unpack this, we're joined on Zoom by Chief People Officer at Deloitte Africa, Lungile Mahluza. Lungile, a very good morning to you. A warm welcome to Morning Live. First of all, I'd like you to give us background into this study and what inspired it in the first place.
Morning, Lebu. So the study is in its third year, and it looks at the experiences of women in the workplace. Now, it's quite important, I think, for us to have a study like this for a couple of different reasons. The lack of data historically around women in particular is something that's very well documented, and we believe that this is a great contribution to starting to create a more equitable workplace. And that really is the background for the study.
What are some of the results that came out this year?
So, as you've already mentioned, there are a couple of things that we've noted. There has been some slight progress, but the progress has been uneven. Specifically, as it relates to women in South Africa, we have seen that at least 49% of the people who responded to the survey believe that they're more stressed or feel more stressed than they did a year ago. 31% of those women also are showing signs of burnout. Now, there are a couple of different reasons for this and a number of drivers, including things like concerns around their physical health. So increasingly, we see that women struggle with the symptoms of menstruation and menopause, and these are things that have historically not been addressed. Women also tend to, outside of the home, carry the bulk of the responsibility for what we'll call unpaid work, right? So all the things outside of formal work that women are typically responsible for. And then, as you mentioned in your earlier segment, the issue around mental health. All of these things are compounding, I think, to result in women feeling overwhelmed and increasingly stressed.
And you'd think that women might find it easier, and the assumption is that they might find it easier to speak about their mental health, but in fact, the opposite is the case, that they are struggling to speak about their mental health in those and the challenges that they face in the workplace.
So, I mean, I think there is still a stigma in terms of mental health. And whilst we are normalizing the conversation in our workplaces, there is still the perception that when people struggle with their mental health, that they cannot speak openly about it. And typically, organizations aren't necessarily creating kinds of cultures that support normalizing these conversations and really just addressing them as part of normal life.
Speak to us about the other subjects that they struggle with. You touched a little bit on that, on menstruation and menopause. What are some of the other subjects that women are struggling to juggle and to speak about in the workplace?
So the issue of flexibility, particularly on the back of COVID, as everyone has tried to rebalance their lives, we've moved into the era of hybrid work. And I think what we're finding is that we sometimes think that flexibility and hybrid work are the same thing, which they aren't necessarily. So the need for flexibility in terms of how work is structured, in terms of where work gets done, in terms of even sort of the hours that women work, and this ability to have a work-life integration rather than a work-life balance in order to manage the various aspects of their lives is also a very important issue. The second issue that we are seeing as well is just around the whole area of financial well-being. a lot of women in the survey would prioritize the careers of their partners over their own because they tend not to be the primary, let's say, earner in the family. And this highlights issues, for instance, around pay and equity around pay, which is another area that is highlighted in the survey.
And I'm curious, the study and the results that you received and the women that you surveyed, are you at liberty to tell us whether in race, in relation to race, how many of these women were black, how many of these women were white?
So I wouldn't have the exact details around the exact stats there, but certainly in terms of the demographic is across race, it is across sector, it is across age and career stage, and it's looking at being quite an inclusive survey in terms of looking at those various dimensions. We actually, even this year, even look at issues around LGBT plus females in the survey as well.
Speak to us about how much of this has to do with, being told or being risen to think, no, you're strong, you're supposed to carry all this weight and still, come home to cook dinner and still be a good wife. How does that contribute to mental health and mental wellness in general for women across the spectrum?
So, I mean, whilst the data doesn't go into empirical, or the study doesn't go into empirical evidence in terms of that, I think we can all acknowledge that just on the basis of the lived experience, our own lived experience, the lived experience of so many women we know, that there are expectations that are often placed on women, and this expectation that women will, conform and take on these roles, and that generally, the expectation is that women are more generally nurturing. I mean, you see this play out in the workplace as well, where the emotional burden of supporting fellow colleagues often falls on women and is often an expectation. So I do certainly think that, anecdotally, you would anticipate that just on the basis of how women tend to be socialized and on the basis of these expectations that are not always verbalized, but where, there is the sense that women need to play into those roles.
And for you, what are some of the aha moments that came up when you were going through this research and the findings?
So, I mean, certainly in terms of looking at just how, as organizations, we need to take a human-centered approach to how we think about and design work and the culture that we have, and allow women to fully contribute, right? I think that, for me, is a very, very important thing. In the past, we've tended to expect people to compartmentalize, and I think we're realizing that we are fully human. And whilst as organizations and as employers, we can't take accountability or responsibility for what happens in people's homes, we can recognize that being fully human means whatever's happening outside of work impacts people in the workplace, and that the kinds of policies and practices that we have in place are very important. That's the first thing. I think secondly, beyond sort of quotas and targets for getting women into the workplace and advancing women in the workplace, we really need to look at whether the culture that we're creating actually helps women to thrive. I think oftentimes the emphasis is on the targets and the numbers and the policies, and that's important, but the environment in which women are working, addressing things like microaggressions, for instance, looking at acts of sponsorship, for instance, are very, very important.
All right, Lungile, thank you so much for speaking to us. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Lungile Mahluza, she is Chief People Officer at Deloitte, speaking to us about the findings of their Women at Work global study, which was conducted last, and then it's in its third year. All right.